Peter Russian leads the consulting and partnership arm for Intent-Based Leadership International. He is responsible for the delivery of services which help organisations to implement the principles and practices of intent-based leadership, including organisation review, training and development, consultancy, business improvement and coaching-based development all around the world. Hello and welcome to Talk Business with Peter.
Hello, David. How are you today?
Yeah, really good. Thank you so much for your time. I know how busy you are, Peter. So take us back to the beginning. What is your leadership backstory that got you to where you are today?
Well, a series of fortunate events, I would say, really. It goes back, I guess, in terms of I graduated back in the early 90s. It was a difficult market. It was in London. Went a little bit from job to job and then found myself working for an organization called the Management Charter Initiative. And I didn't really know at that stage, I had no idea that how much the role and focus of the Management Charter Initiative, which was around leadership and management, would actually play a kind of vital anchor in what happened in the subsequent kind of 20-25 years. So that organization was set up to set standards for what good leadership and management looks like. And I was really fortunate. It was pretty much my first, what I would say is proper job. And it was quite tough. I had some hard taskmasters or mistresses that I worked with. But I also had a couple of kind of guardian angels and one person in particular who I think just took me under her wing and helped me to think a lot in terms of how we work with other people, what leadership looks like, and also what does strategy look like. And from that point onwards, I kind of had a great sort of platform. So quite quickly, I then moved into the Investors and People organization, which is quite a well-known brand in the UK. I started off working in the UK in the kind of head office, and progressed reasonably quickly to become director of development there. So my principal role was again about understanding what does good look like when organizations work and develop their people. And then the opportunity came to take up the role of being chief executive of Investors and People in Scotland. And it was kind of an interesting opportunity. Get out of London, go and live somewhere else. Just got married to a Scottish person, although we have some dispute now in terms of who wanted to move to Scotland and back. I'm Scottish by birth, and that's where I am today. So I spent about 15 years with Investors and People in Scotland. Great job. But probably about 10 years into that role, there was something which was beginning to itch me, and it was this: that we Investors and People, we spent a lot of time reviewing what organizations did and how good they were, and it became obvious to me that organizations were spending a lot of money and a lot of time on trying to develop leaders and trying to make leaders better. But it was almost just kind of cyclical basis. They seemed to do it every 2 or 3 years. So, there's a polish, take people off site, polish them, put them back into the system. And then when the polish wears off, take them out again and polish. Anyway, so I was quite curious about this. And one day somebody said to me, "Have you read this book, Turn the Ship Around?" So I'd read quite a lot of business and leadership books, and I'd finished some of them, and they kind of fell into two categories. One was the heroic story of how I single-handedly changed a city. Giuliani, right, is the perfect example. So quite an engaging story. Might have a slightly different view on him now. Secondly, the kind of worthy but not particularly interesting textbook. And what I loved about Turn the Ship Around was it was told a brilliant story without a sense of ego from the author, but also was really practical in saying, and by the way, here's the things that you need to think about. So it was almost like a eureka moment, jumping out of the bath and going, whoa, this is different. But here's the thing. Not only was I thinking about this in terms of the context of what I saw in other organizations who are clients of Investors and People, it's speaking to me as a leader in my own in the organization that I was working for, because I was trying to do all of the things which I thought good leaders would do. But similarly, I kind of saw short-term effects, and then I needed to work on it again. Short-term burst, then things fall off. And I remember sitting in a boardroom one day with our executive team at Investors and People, and we asked a question: how do we get them more engaged? And it suddenly went off. Hold on. As long as we're talking about getting them more engaged, we're never going to get to the root of the problem.
Yeah.
So from there, reached out to David, brought him across to Scotland for a couple of activities, and we began working together. And that really culminated in 2018, a further discussion. And I left the job at Investors and People to join Turn the Ship Around organization. And then very recently, just at the beginning of March, the culmination of that was then forming Intent-Based Leadership International, which is now the organization to take forward a kind of the goal and the flag for encouraging the use of this approach across the world.
Yeah. Many people listening would recognize and probably smile when you mentioned the seasons of polish, where there'll be these training, it'll become fashionable within a company for a bit. We'll bring people out with potential, or people that haven't been on a training course for a while, and give them a polish. Talk to me just briefly about what some of those exercises were, or what some of that polish was that didn't particularly become effective in terms of training, Peter.
Yeah, I mean, I think you start with the overall premise was, we're going to make you a better leader so you have better followers. And so to make you a better leader, you've got to be more visionary. You've got to be more empathetic. You've got to be good at having difficult conversations. So all of those things, you've got to be a better communicator. So all of those things, in terms of trying to make a leader better at engaging and creating followers, there's a logic there. But again, the challenge was, well, it's all about you as the individual, not about thinking about the team as a whole.
Yeah.
So leadership resides and stays with a small group of people at the top of the organization or the top of the team. And it doesn't matter whether it's a big organization or a team that I was working, which is about 30 people. As long as you have a sense of saying, there are some people who are the deciders and there are some people who are the doers, then you persist, or the problem persists. So yeah, it was the classic, what I would say, classic leadership capabilities. That's what we're going to develop. That's what we're going to do.
You work with all sorts of size companies all around the world. What are some of the most common traits that you find in the most successful leaders?
Great question. I think the first thing I would say is it's an awareness of ego. So I'm not saying it's necessarily a lack of ego. It's an awareness of ego and the impact that you can have on other people. So, for example, I was working with an organization last night, and obviously we're doing everything online now, but with about 20 people in a senior team. And it became really obvious to me that the CEO had that awareness in terms of understanding the impact that he had, just simply in terms of contributing to the discussion. So he was very deliberately pausing and waiting to hear what other people had said before he started to offer his own perspective and his own contribution. And for me, I guess that it's a sense of ego, it's self-awareness about the impact that you as a leader have on the people around you, and how do you adjust in order to get the insight and perspective and honesty, I think, that as a leader you're really looking for.
Yeah. A mistake that a lot of leaders make can be buying into this mindset that they need to be seen as the smartest person in the room and have all the answers to everyone else's problems. Tell us why that is wrong.
Well, because you can never be. Well, if you first two reasons. One, intuitively, if you're in a room of 10 people and you think you're the smartest one and it's only your view that counts, then inevitably you're heading for a fall. Now, in a group of 10 people, 10 whatever number, nobody can see what everyone sees. So what I might see as a leader might be different to what another person in the room sees. It's going to be different to another person. different to another person. So we all see things through a slightly different lens. So the first priority, or the first proposition there is, a leader cannot see what everyone else can see. And the job of a leader then is about, I think, getting insight, perspective and experience in order to inform decisions. So one of the myths I think that can come about with intent-based leadership is that it's about decision making by consensus. Everybody has to have their say, and once everybody's had their say, then we'll arrive at a good consensus. That's not what this is about.
Yeah.
What I think a good leader does is to draw out perspective and information and data, and then using that is able to either make the decision or find the person who's best placed to make that decision.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, one person on their own. The other risk is, if you're always the answer man, you'll never ever, your day is going to be from 6 o'clock in the morning till 9 o'clock at night. Can you help me with this? Can you help me with this? Now, I would reflect on my own experience here in my role at Investors and People. When somebody new joined, I've made a very deliberate point of saying, right, well, I'd like to have a conversation with you, maybe about a month into your role, and we'll check in and see how the induction process has been. And I always said, look, you must remember this door is always open. So, if you've ever got an issue or if there's anything you ever want to talk about or need any help, come and talk to me. They go, oh, great. Yeah, thanks very much. That's good. Now, there are two problems with that. Number one, that door was not always open. So it was a lie, because sometimes it needed to be closed. But number two, who was I really helping? Well, every time somebody came to me and said, hey, Peter, can you, I've got a bit of an issue here. Can you help me? I would want to respond because it made me feel really good. Oh, great. Somebody's asking me for my expertise.
Yeah.
So I immediately lean in and I want to be able to provide my wisdom. And here's what I see. And this is what I think you might be able to do. And they might say, oh, thanks very much. That's great.
Yeah. And
it seemed to work, but it was very short term, because every time I did that, I stopped somebody learning.
Yeah.
But it appealed to me and almost my sense of identity as a leader. That's what leaders do, isn't it? They help solve problems. In fact, you will still see well-established leadership gurus saying, if you don't have, there's a famous quote, if you don't have 10 people coming to you asking for you help in terms of solving problems, then you've lost your role as a leader. Well, for me, it's not about the leader solving the problems for other people. It's helping people to see whether they can solve the problem for themselves.
So good. I'm a big fan of the Leadership Nudges YouTube channel that you and David have got. And in fact, I've got to apologise, Peter. I actually gave David the credit for a video that you did on LinkedIn.
But my ego obviously didn't get in the way. I just naturally felt happy.
But David took the credit for it because it was that good. But I'd love you just because I think it fits in so well here, because, again, I'll just repeat what I said to David. I watched that and I literally, it's one of those moments when your jaw, you can physically feel it drop a little bit, because I do it all. That is what I do. And I thought I was doing a good job. The team meeting, you set the agenda and you can set the tone for it. Tell me the backstory and almost deliver that nudge, if you can, how you did it before, because it was just so good.
Okay, so the backstory, again, probably goes back to what I thought good looked like, which was, I've got a message, I need to get people on board. And I kept getting feedback. Oh, one of the really good things about you, Peter, as a leader is you're really articulate. And that fed me. So I thought, right, well, when we've got a decision to be made, my job is to provide the information and to share with people what the compelling case is. This is the option. This is what I think we should be doing. Now, I'm interested in other views. Really?
Yeah.
So the point is this: as soon as the most senior person in the room shares their opinion, it anchors the conversation. And the reaction from other people around the room could be, it's not always the case, could be one, oh, okay, so that's what he thinks. I'm going to line up behind that because it's in my interests to make sure that we think alike.
Yeah.
It could be, well, I have a different opinion, but I'm not prepared to put my head above the parapet and offer a different perspective. It's not worth it for me. Or three, it could be simply, well, that's what he thinks. So what's the point? Why am I even going to bother speaking up? Let's move on. So by pausing and inviting people to speak first, and inviting people to share their perspective, I think it does a couple of things. One, it creates the opportunity for people to speak up, because if the leader's not speaking, other people have got the opportunity to speak. Secondly, it means that people are going to be unencumbered and not influenced by necessarily how do I line up behind what the most senior person in the room is thinking. But the third, and I think a really interesting element, is it's a mechanism for understanding the level of competence and clarity that the team have got. And this came from one of our clients in the US who I was talking to a couple of weeks ago. And one of the senior leaders there was telling me, she said, look, I've been practicing speaking last, and this is what I've noticed. About 8 or 9 times out of 10, when I speak last or I pause, somebody else in the team will say what I was going to say. So good, that's good in terms of you're giving people a voice, you're giving people a sense of involvement in decision making. But she said, here's the second thing. It's allowing me to have a much better understanding of their capability and their competence. Yeah. Because if I'd said that myself and then somebody, well, yeah, I agree with Terry, then that insight would have been lost. So I think there are multiple reasons and multiple values in terms of the leader pausing. Doesn't mean to say you don't say anything. You might need to provide information. You might need to set the context. The key thing is about not sharing your perspective and your opinion.
Yeah, brilliant. The last 18 months have been crazy for so many different businesses, transformed the way that, you know, the majority of businesses do business. What is the best way for a leader to help embed cultural change? And what advice do you have for companies that may have not faced any change for years and have people that are resistant to that change?
I think the key thing is its involvement, transparency and involvement. So to be clear about what the situation is, and then as far as possible to involve people in the change that is happening. So what we know is that when change is done to people and it's a fait accompli, this is what's going to happen. You can work as hard as you like in terms of telling people why it's important and the reasons that you're doing it. But if they don't have a sense of involvement and a sense of being able to influence some aspect of their new future, then the risk is you're going to create people who become detached from the purpose, detached from the change process, become frustrated, and then you're going to have to work that much harder in terms of recovering the position. But it's where you've got an opportunity and giving people an opportunity to influence their future. I think that for me is the key thing. And it doesn't need to be, sometimes that you might think, well, we just simply can't, or we don't have an opportunity to involve people because the factors are too big. It might come down to as small as, well, what does the future working arrangement look like? What are we going to do in terms of the classic one on the agenda at the moment, isn't it? So what's going to happen after COVID goes in terms of working from home? Yeah. So are you going to go down the road of saying, well, 2 or 3 of us as leaders are going to meet and decide what the best policy is, and then we're going to tell people, but we're going to tell them really clearly about why we're changing it or what we're going to do? Or are you going to involve people? Yeah. So I think for me, the key in terms of change is involve people, and David may have talked about this last week, the transparency. So transparency is absolutely fundamental in terms of developing trust. And as soon as you're not transparent, you can begin to, your expectation might be, should be, that there will be some impact and trust will be compromised in some way. You're not being clear with me. You're not being transparent with me.
Yeah, really good stuff. Should all leaders have a development plan? And if so, what is the best way to ensure that the leader is aware of all of their own blind spots?
Well, so that's a great question. I think I would say development plan with a small d. So am I saying, well, every leader needs to have some written form of development plan? I'm not sure, but I think that it is important that a leader has a sense of where is my improvement and development coming from? What am I doing to not just prove that I'm a good leader, but to improve my capability as a leader? Now, there are a couple of areas that I would always go to, but one of them I think is reasonably traditional, and I really believe in it, which is coaching.
Yeah.
But the second aspect is about, it's an extension of coaching, but it's about what I would call live coaching. So let me just clarify the difference. So I've really valued the coaching relationship I've had with my coach, largely, I guess, probably for about 10 years. So we had a little bit of a gap, and I've come back to my coach now. And we have this is part of the Vistage network, which I think is quite well known in the UK. And so I have a monthly 2-hour session with my coach, and we talk about challenges, and I find that really helpful in terms of thinking through what the issues are and the challenges we're facing might be. So I really believe in the power of that type of one-to-one coaching. But one of the things that we do when we work with clients is to do observational based activity as well. So it's, I guess, the equivalent of thinking about it in terms of how a sports coach works with an athlete or a golfer or whatever. So the equivalent of those one-to-one conversations take place on the training ground or the practice ground or on the range. But the coach doesn't then walk away and not observe the live performance.
Yeah. So
one of the things that we do is that we observe leaders in action in their next meeting, even in one-to-one conversations that they might be having, because that's as pure as you get in terms of understanding what a leader's approach is really like. When push comes to shove and you're faced with a meeting of people and there are questions which are emerging, what happens in that situation? So we think one of the most powerful ways that an individual, a leader, can develop is by having that type of third eye of somebody observing an activity and then providing what observational based feedback in terms of what we saw, what we noticed, and whether the intent of the leader, but when you said that particular point, what was your intention? What did you hope to achieve?
Yeah. And
what did you notice? What was the reality? So the more you can get towards the real behaviors of leaders, the more I think impactful the development can be.
Yeah, brilliant. When delivering a culture of empowerment, specifically thinking of poor performance for a moment, there are going to be times when things go wrong and the leader will need to step in and address this, and even at times go down the road of discipline and exiting people from the business. Tell me about how the two can work together and the best way to avoid it coming to this.
Yeah. So I think the starting point is we have to understand what drives people's behaviors. So there are a couple of approaches here, and I again would reflect that in my previous roles, I fell into the category probably of when something went wrong or performance wasn't at the level that we wanted to, it was very easy to assume this must be something to do with their attitude. It must be something to do with they haven't got the capability. So I think there's a default reaction when dealing with underperformance is to assume it's all to do with the individual. Where we would go is to say, first of all, look at the environment. Look at the environment that somebody's operating in and understand what impact might that be having on their performance. So, for example, we were working with a really big manufacturer in the United States, we went and observed. We stood in a big food production factory, and we watched people on their roles, and one person obviously had a very big backlog of work, and it was piling up, and the supervisor was just complaining and saying, and this was an early stage in our work with the company. Supervisor saying, we've got some real concerns about this person's capability. But what emerged was she didn't actually have the right tools for the job. She was being asked to cut things using a knife, but the knife was really blunt, and she'd been asking for maybe a month, can I have a replacement? It hadn't come. So that's one simple example of where we have to understand what the environment looks like and how that might be influencing somebody's performance before we move on to then thinking about what does this mean from an individual capability. And when we think about it from an individual capability, again, there's a useful little mechanism that we use. 3 C's. Does somebody have the clarity of what's expected of them in this role? Do they have the competence to be able to do the job? And finally, do they have control over the activities that we're asking them to do? Again, that might be a useful way of getting to the root of the issue. Now, ultimately, maybe you've been through, looked at the environment, looked at the 3 C's. So I think the final aspect when we're dealing with performance is, again, to try and hold back from being the judge. Now, that might sound a little bit odd, because surely from a performance management perspective, aren't we, by its very nature, moving into some form of judging role? We are assessing the role. Well, here's another way of thinking about it. If we share what we see and what we observe, I noticed that you've been late for work for the last 3 days. And you stop short of making a judgment, and you stop short of explaining the impact, because what we want to do is to get the other person to do the thinking.
Yeah.
And maybe to share, well, actually, this is what's happening for me at the moment. Okay, so what do you think the impact of that might be? Well, I could see that actually it's maybe having a negative impact on other members of the team. Okay, that's helpful. What help do you need in terms of addressing that? Well, this would be. So all of the time, what you're trying to do is to work on this idea that as a leader, we are there to help somebody do the thinking for themselves. And I think sometimes the risk with performance management is it comes down, I'm going to play the role of the judge. This is what I've noticed. I don't think you're performing to the right level. I think that you need to improve. I think that unless you improve, there's going to be a consequence for you.
Yeah.
The more we can shift that conversation to get the recipient doing that thinking, I think the more chances we've got of keeping them in the organization and not exiting them.
Yeah, amazing. Peter, you are awesome. I could speak to you for hours, and the last half an hour which has flown by. Do you have any closing thoughts? And also let people know how they can keep in touch with you via social media or via your website.
Yeah, so I've reinforced probably the message that if you watch David's podcast, go on to our website, intentbasedleadership.com, and sign up to one of our nudges. That's typically David will share a 90-second film each week with you. And I suppose it comes down to, how do we change? We change fundamentally, we believe, like we're learning a sport or learning a language. So try it. Well, it's a bit like going to the gym. I went to the gym, and afterwards I came back and I weighed myself and I hadn't lost any weight. Yeah. So I'm never going back to the gym, because that doesn't work. So this change and this different approach to leadership requires practice. So signing up to our nudges is a great starting point. You can find me on LinkedIn. There are not many Peter Russians around, and I'm also on Twitter at Pete_Russian. And really happy to engage and talk to anybody who's interested.
Excellent. Well, we're going to make sure that we've got the links to your LinkedIn and your Twitter and the leadership nudges in the description below. Peter, thanks again for your time. I really enjoyed it.
My pleasure, David. Thank you.